Shondell Jackson. This is Shondell Jackson. In 2010, Jackson, who was 19 at the time, was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide and robbery in the case of 21-year-old University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee student Nathan Potter. Potter was walking home to his apartment when Jackson and 20-year-old Derek Thomas attempted to rob him. Potter wasn't carrying any money. In a fit of rage, Shondell shot Potter, which led to his ultimate death. The authorities were eventually called to the scene, but it was already too late. During the trial over the victim's death and his crime, Jackson showed no remorse or sorrow and even smiled at the victim's family at one point when he was escorted outside of the courtroom. Jackson became violent after his sentencing. As the news reporter said, the police in the courtroom acted quickly, as if they had expected it, and they did because the convicted killer had acted that way during his trial. Officers had to restrain him using pepper spray. Just moments before, Jackson's attorney had asked Dalit to consider the 19-year-old's youth and, as the attorney put it, his lack of impulse control. At the trial of Jackson, members of his family stood in the back of the courtroom and taunted Potter's family. A woman yelled toward the Potters. Another woman yelled toward Potter's mother and father, who held each other and wept. During the trial, Potter's father, John Potter, addressed Judge Rebecca Dalit saying, "There's nothing that can be said to bring back our Nathan," but he asked for punishment to fit the horrific crime. "Is there such a thing as pure evil? We think so," he inquired. Jackson was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide and robbery and was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Jackson will serve his sentence until he dies. He is currently 31 years old and has already served 12 years in jail. Jaleel Smith Riley. This is Jaleel Smith Riley. At the age of 23, he pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and attempted murder, but decided to withdraw his plea against the advice of his attorneys. Riley killed a 20-year-old woman, Portia Brooks, and seriously injured her boyfriend, Aaron Martin. The couple were in Brooks' car when Riley came up to the car with two others looking to rob them. Riley shot Martin after realizing that he didn't have any cash on him. Martin was shot in the head, resulting in permanent brain damage, after which Brooks was shot and she eventually died 3 days later. Judge Charles Kubicki of the Hamilton County Common Pleas Court rejected Smith Riley's apology and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Footage from the courtroom incident clearly shows Riley's repentant apologies, but that wouldn't help his notion at all. After receiving his sentence, Smith Riley collapsed to the floor of Kubicki's courtroom. Smith Riley was pulled to his feet by the police and then interrupted Kubicki. Smith Riley was unclear as to whom he was referring in his outburst. The counsel for Smith Riley said an appeal was likely, but hadn't been filed yet. Norwood Police Lieutenant Tom Fallon told reporters that Smith Riley had confessed to the crime, in addition to pleading guilty. Earlier in Wednesday's proceedings, member of Brooks and Martin's families addressed the court and asked Kubicki to deny Smith Riley's parole. Portia's mother, Sharon Brooks, said,
"He ruined my life. He not only killed her, but he killed me. Mentally, emotionally, he killed my identity as a mother of 3. We are left with nothing but pictures, videos, and memories, and that's because of him."
The ashes of Portia were brought to the court by Sharon Brooks. Portia's sister, Tia Marie Brooks, addressed the crowd in an emotional speech.
"Judge Kubicki, please give him the max. With life, I have to deal with life without Portia, so he should deal with life without parole."
Riley was charged with 1 count of murder and was convicted. He was sentenced to a life in prison for his heinous crimes. He remains there today at the age of 28 years. Anthony Rodriguez. This is Anthony Rodriguez, who had just turned 18 and was on parole when he robbed, kidnapped, and sexually assaulted 25-year-old woman in Martin Luther King Jr. Park, dragging her 105 feet into a bathroom. Anthony had previous arrests for violence, but this appeared to be his first for sexual assault, according to reports. Rodriguez raped a woman in March 2012 in Martin Luther King Jr. Park. Bakersfield police have said he was arrested on May 4, 2012, after DNA evidence linked him to the crime. The Kirk County District Attorney said that Anthony had been quiet throughout the entire ordeal, but that changed when the judge sentenced him to 25 years to life. Rodriguez immediately began talking to the judge with tears in his eyes, uttered profanities, and called the ruling unfair. He was reluctantly forced to take a seat. After the trial, Anthony was clearly not happy with the outcome, and neither was his family. His mother said that he did not deserve life in prison, and that something was wrong for him to receive such a heavy sentence. Anthony wasn't the first person arrested for the same crime. In fact, Mike Zarate Jacobo was arrested on suspicion of sexual assault and stayed in downtown jail for 35 days until DNA evidence cleared him. The evidence instead linked 18-year-old Anthony Rodriguez to the crime. Sean Riker. This is Sean Riker, Wisconsin's resident Riker, who was sentenced to 200 years in prison for terrorizing his family. Riker was convicted of 16 crimes in November 2009, including first-degree sexual assault of a child, physical abuse of a child, and reckless endangering. The 43-year-old is already serving 7.5 years for damaging the Racine County Jail, and his 200-year sentence will begin when that time ends. Riker's recent court outburst has been described as one of the craziest out there, as he spews insults and verbal abuses onto the court judge. During the aforementioned incident, he was in court to waive his constitutional right to appear at his sentencing. He was also accompanied by a heavily armed security team. He was restrained with shackles and a spit mask because he had already escaped from a Wisconsin jail and has been uncooperative with court security. When Riker enters the room, the spit mask may be on, but the gloves are off, as he immediately begins throwing insults at Judge Wayne Merrick. Reports tell us that Judge Wayne Merrick had doubts that Riker could be rehabilitated. Riker refused to show up for his sentencing. Defense lawyer Richard Hart said he had discussed Riker's behavior with him, but was unable to find a clear explanation. He says that even though Riker is flawed, he's a human being who has shown the ability to love. Daryl Brooks. Daryl Brooks is the individual who was convicted of killing 6 people and injuring dozens of others after he drove his SUV into a Christmas parade in Waukesha, Wisconsin. During his reckless driving, he was reported to have reached speeds of over 30 miles per hour, and the prosecution argued that his driving rampage was deliberate. He kept going until he reached the end of the line, and there weren't any more people to hit. He reportedly plowed through 68 different people. Brooks was arrested, and the charged Brooks decided to represent himself in court. The judge was urged to tell him,
"If you are allowed to represent yourself in this case, sir, you will not have attorneys assisting you. They are gone from this case. Do you understand that?"
To which Brooks replied,
"I think I will probably be better served representing myself."
Brooks was removed multiple times for constant interruptions and outbursts. It was here that his real personality was shown when he starts to laugh during a witness testimony. Back in the courtroom, Brooks had an outburst as he didn't like how the district attorney pronounced the word defendant. Brooks was clearly frustrated as he decides to have a stare down with the judge. Brooks was found guilty of all 76 charges against him by the jury, which also gave him 6 life sentences plus over 700 additional years in prison. Danta Wright. This is Danta Wright for the murder of an Ann Arbor 18-year-old, Jordan Klee. He was charged with armed robbery, conspiracy to commit armed robbery, felony firearm, and second-degree murder. Wright was sentenced to 23 to 50 years in prison for the murder of Klee. Wright confessed at the hearing in June that he and 2 other friends were attempting to rob 18-year-old Jordan Klee when he shot and killed him. In a shocking sight at Washtenaw County, Michigan courtroom, as his victim's family read impact statements before the court, Wright sat smiling and nearly laughing. A family member read in court on behalf of the victim's grieving mother.
"I've lost my only child, my son, my baby, my friend. More than that, I've lost laughter and love. I no longer have the hope of having grandchildren."
Afterward, the defendant, 17-year-old Danta Wright, addressed the court saying,
"I'll be home soon, R.I.P. Keon, I love my family."
Wright's attitude didn't sit well with the judge, who asked the prosecutors if the sentencing agreement was too lenient. 22nd Circuit Judge David Schwartz said,
"Watching you sit there, smile and laugh and shake your head like this was no big deal, I'm very tempted to just say, I'm not going to accept this sentence agreement. We'll go to trial, and if you're convicted of felony murder, you'll go to prison for the rest of your life. That means you'll die there." That's what I'm tempted to do.
During a brief recess, the family is reported to have asked the case not to go to trial because they wanted to move forward. Wright's lawyer apologized on his behalf after the break, explaining that he suffers from emotional issues and that he meant no harm by his smile. Jacob Matthew Morgan. This is Jacob Matthew Morgan. The 17-year-old from South Carolina intentionally set fire to his home, killing his 14-month-old brother, Joshua Alexander Hill. According to court documents, Matt would set at least 2 fires inside the trailer home and then leave the residence. After he willfully left his 14-month-old brother in the burning residence, authorities would charge him with murder. Matt Morgan's parents informed authorities that he suffers from a number of mental health issues, including being on the autism spectrum. The court found that Jacob had set 2 fires and then left the home, leaving his brother inside to die. Jacob has not given formal statements regarding how the fire started, but he later stated that he lit the pillow on fire and threw it into the air. Authorities believe that the two sets of fires were started, one in the master bedroom where the baby was asleep and another in the living room. Regardless of this teen killer's age, he will be sentenced to prison for a total of 15 years to life. Before he was charged with arson and murder, Jacob cried, pleaded, and prayed with absolute terror in his eyes. He was then led out of the courtroom crying. Mother Julie Hill said Jacob has developmental issues and loved his little brother, but no crime can go unpunished. Jacob was initially charged with murder and pleaded guilty to the crime in October 2021. He was charged with involuntary manslaughter, unlawful conduct towards a child, and third-degree arson. Lucas Kendall. This is Lucas Kendall, an American man who was convicted of second-degree murder with a firearm and attempted second-degree murder for a 2012 shooting that killed Kilwan Beard and left Michael Smathers paralyzed. Kendall was working at a strip club where Kilwan Beard and his family, Michael Smathers, had gone out for a night out. They decided to leave the club and sit in Michael's car for a while before returning to the club minutes later. Kendall put on his uniform and prepared for his shift. He put on a vest, gloves, baton, knife, gun, and ammunition. All three men looked at each other before Kendall retreated to the club. As Bird and Smathers were getting out of the car to return to the club, Kendall opened fire and shot Bird in the back 8 times, killing him. Smathers was left paralyzed below the waist. During Kendall's trial, he claimed insanity and requested to be placed in a mental institution instead of a prison. Bird's father began yelling at Kendall, screaming that he had murdered his son for no reason. Family members and security guards attempted to calm Bird's father, but he was ultimately forced to be dragged out of the courtroom during the trial. There was no evidence presented, no testimony, and no court-appointed counsel accepted. Kendall was sentenced to life in prison after being found guilty of murder and attempted murder. Kendall was 29 years old when he was convicted of murdering Bird and attempting to murder Smathers in 2012.